So to start off Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends week, well, it could have been a month, but due to schedule changing, I have to wait for most of the stuff that I look at. The first episode I'm going to be looking at is Worldwide Wabbit, which is part of the first season of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Frankie shows Blue and Mac the website of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, while her goal at the moment is to make multiple interviews from some imaginary friends so that they can be adopted. And I gotta be really honest with you, the idea of having a website to promote fosters at a time where YouTube wasn't even born, and the fact that the internet was still at its prime in 2004 when it comes to less activity, it's really understandable that a website should be something that can get some people's attention in order to adopt the imaginary friends, because without the website, the only people who can adopt imaginary friends are the people in the city that Fosters is at. Mr. Herriman demands Frankie to do more chores as usual, so she offers Blue and Mac to do the interviews, and while doing the interviews, they come across Madame Foster's apartment while Mr. Herriman is doing a dance with Madame Foster, because if you're fully aware of how Mr. Herriman is, he is Madame Foster's imaginary friend, and what Blue and Mac caught on camera, it's gonna be extremely embarrassing. When they show it to Frankie, Mr. Herriman does this funny bunny stunt that he usually does in front of Madame Foster, and it's so hilarious that Frankie is completely enjoying every single moment of it. And considering that this is Frankie we're talking about, who cannot stand the orders from Mr. Herriman, you can probably be in her shoes if you do not like Mr. Herriman as a character. But for this episode, along with some, Mr. Herriman is actually tolerable, and you actually sigh for him for how he's being treated by so many people, especially with the video that Blue and Mac recorded. And the episode gets a lot more complicated for Mac because the rest of the Foster's residents, and yes, I do say Foster's residents as in imaginary friends, see the video with Mr. Herriman and Madame Foster. And to be quite honest, Mac completely going against all this is really understandable, because he did laugh at the video at the beginning of the episode where he recorded it the first time, and then throughout the majority of this episode, he's completely calm about it, and then soon Frankie is starting to be fully aware of what's truly gonna happen with her job if Mr. Herriman finds out about this. And believe me when I say this, is that this episode, compared to episodes I've seen in later seasons when it comes to Mr. Herriman, this episode really knows how to make an episode execute perfectly with Mr. Herriman's character. When it comes to the first season of this show, Mr. Herriman, like every other character in the show, needs some development in order to get an understanding of their character. And in this episode, he's tolerable considering the fact that he's just doing his job, and the video that became viral in this episode wasn't entirely his fault. You can really tell that the moment that he did with Madame Foster is just something that he does for his career. And when it comes to later appearances, Mr. Herriman in the first season is just basically those characters who just doesn't understand what people think about the internet and stuff like that. And believe me when I say this, is that whenever I see Mr. Herriman in the first season, I mostly side with him because of the fact that everything that ends up happening in this episode, he deserves better. And it's mainly the fact that Blue was the one who kept the video and uploaded it all over the world. It's honestly unbelievable to actually see Blue in this state on the fact that his flannelization was insignificant in the first two seasons, but later on, it just gets worse and worse. You know, when shows usually do flannelization and the fact that these characters are going to be a lot more different as the series goes on, it really makes this episode lose most of the credibility when it comes to Blue's flannelization. I mean, granted, he didn't know better when it comes to the internet and how he managed to get all the merchandise, but at the same time, this is still over the line, especially at the fact that posting the video all over the internet is something that it's the last thing you should do if you want someone to get embarrassed. Granted, Mr. Herriman didn't get embarrassed, but we're going to get to that once we get to the end of this episode. I will say that when the episode continues on, you can really understand that the imaginary friends have no understanding of what the environment is when it comes to the internet, technology, and stuff like that. I mean, Frankie is literally the only character that is aware of this, despite the fact that she wants revenge. And Mac, considering that he's the voice of reason, like every other appearance that he makes in this episode, you can really tell that he just wants to avoid the embarrassment and also crisis situation that ensues at the end of this episode. Watching this episode for preparation of this review, I can honestly tell that the imaginary friends, mainly Oswaldo, Wilt, and Coco, who doesn't understand how the society works, which shows in the very first episode, Star Wars, I can tell that this episode really knew what to do when it comes to the imaginary friends not learning of how society works, and the fact that they don't even understand how an unexpected wage would happen for Mr. Herriman. This show is really well known when it comes to waging moments, which is mostly overrated in my book. But when it comes to this situation, it's extremely justified for Mr. Herriman, since that he doesn't even understand how the internet works, and the fact that people are laughing at the announcements that he makes really goes to show that he really isn't into the society, especially in 2004 when this episode was released. And when we see Mr. Herriman see himself on the news in the Funny Bunny stunt that he did in front of Madame Foster, he instantly flips out, and I don't usually blame him. And he needs to find the file that is on the internet, which is not possible because the files that he's used to isn't the same files that the other characters are talking about. Which also leads to Mr. Herriman filming Mac Blue, just like they did to him earlier this episode. Considering that this is basically Mr. Herriman's vengeance on just trying to cause embarrassment on Blue and Mac, I can tell that this scene was funnier back then, but looking at it now, it's not really handled, mainly the fact that these are imaginary friends we're talking about who doesn't understand technology and stuff. And as that scene ends, Mr. Herriman needs to go to a different place in order to calm himself down, but this just leads to him being in front of a large news broadcast. And we get to the portion that Mr. Herriman doesn't want to get laughed at for the stunt that he did while Blue and Mac recorded it. Granted that this entire sequence involving the broadcast chasing Mr. Herriman and the fact that there's a helicopter completely recording the whole thing really goes to show that Mr. Herriman isn't really the outside person in front of so many people. And it's mostly a shame because these are one of the only episodes we actually get to see Mr. Herriman being somewhat likable, but at the same time, later on, he becomes a little bit more hateable for how he's being treating the other characters. I can understand that restricted characters like him is supposed to have a purpose in order to follow the plot in episodes, but looking at this episode alone, I honestly think that he really had a really poor development as the series goes on. But if I'm ever going to talk about those episodes at a later time, it will have to be a time where I'm actually interested into talking about the development of the characters. But I'm only doing episode reviews from this show, not analysis videos like I do with other media. But when we see the broadcast and children about to talk to Mr. Herriman, they don't make fun of him. In fact, they're actually impressed for the fact that he really did a good stunt in front of Madame Foster. So much that he actually got a fan base on doing the funny bun dance and the quotes that Mr. Herriman said to Madame Foster, which is his creator. And whenever I completely see this scene and compare it to what I see from the majority of this episode, the end of this is really unexpected on the fact that Mr. Herriman actually did something right, despite the fact that it wasn't his full intention and not entirely his fault when it comes to embarrassing himself. At the end of this episode, we see him making an announcement in front of other imaginary friends on the fact that he actually did the most adoptions, and he made a video where he's actually hip-hopping rapping. Well, it's basically a hip-hop version of Funny Bunny. And whether I completely see this, it's actually humorous to actually see Mr. Herriman in this. But compared to what we see him do in the 6th season, I'm pretty sure that some of you guys are familiar with, it really makes this episode easily forgotten. Let me tell you this. The reason why I picked this episode to be part of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends Week is the fact that this episode is actually ahead of its time, but also giving some kind of development with some of the secondary characters. I wouldn't say this is one of my favorite episodes from the show, but looking at it now and understanding how these characters are structured when it comes to the plot of this episode, I can say that this episode was really underway and solid when it comes to how it's executed. For the fact that this episode was released in 2004, at a time that YouTube wasn't even born, along with other platforms that are continuing to growing, this episode was really ahead of its time, while being at a time where the internet just isn't as powerful as it used to be at the present moment. Trust me when I say this, is that I actually found this episode really relatable on the fact that embarrassment, which leads to unintentional fame, and the fact that these characters, when it comes to how they're executed, really makes this episode pretty much an episode that none other non-fan or newcomer should miss. Because believe me when I say this, is that this episode actually does some great choices, and seeing great choices compared to the bad choices that the show did as the series goes on, it honestly makes me depressed, and I'm gonna get to those once we get into the second to last review of this week. Anyway, I give this episode a 7 out of 10, and this week of Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends has just started.
Let's get this started again.